Great. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining and attending. Welcome to our very first Alpha Technology webinar. We're going to talk today about how everything that we're living through as, as kind of like the world right now is going to reshape the future of remote work. And for that, Max Faingezicht is joining me today. How are you, Max?
I'm doing great, thank you. And that's great pronunciation, by the way. I always thought like, how do you pronounce it? How do you do it? So it's awesome.
Well, we have to say that, Max and I know each other from like a couple of years ago. So yeah, and then I also took some German classes back in college that I think help with the pronunciation.
Definitely.
That's awesome. All right, so let's get things started by introducing ourselves first. My name is Jose Ortiz. I am the VP of Technology in ALPFA Boston. Technology is a vertical that is relatively new in our Boston chapter in Alpha. We started it last year. We hosted one event. This year, the plan is to keep growing. We're definitely going to keep our virtual events going for as long as we have to, and hopefully, towards the end of the year, we can move to at least doing one physical event. But for all of you in Boston that are either working right now in technology or interested in technology, this is definitely going to be something that is going to grow, and we look forward to having you involved and receiving your feedback as well. So, all right, Max. So please tell us a little bit more about yourself. So what do you do right now? What have you done? And where are you from? How you started kind of like your journey in the United States as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of my story with the audience and with Alpha. So I was born and raised in Costa Rica. I did my schooling undergrad in Costa Rica as an electrical engineer. And I come from a very entrepreneurial family. So the last name doesn't sound very Latin, but my dad was actually also born and raised in Costa Rica. We come from Polish and German roots. My grandparents were also entrepreneurs who came during the World War. And so ever since I was a kid, I was kind of brought up on, a lot of entrepreneurial DNA kind of around the dinner table. So after working in pretty technical roles early on in my career, I did artificial intelligence and genetic algorithms before they were cool. We didn't have all the fancy stuff that we've got now, but I was working on some pretty cool things early on. As an engineer, I did my stint there, but then ultimately started my own small business. And when I say entrepreneurial backgrounds, it's really small businesses that I was kind of brought up around. And
that was all back in Costa Rica, right?
Yeah, all of this is in Costa Rica. So I started this small company and realized that, as much as I had a lot of engineering knowledge on how to set up, all of the technical aspects of the company, I had a lot of gaps in terms of marketing and how to actually, scale up the sales side of a business and, of course, finance, accounting. So I decided to come to the US for a grad degree. I did an MBA at MIT. So I came in 2009, and that's my kind of first foray into the US. Did my 2-year program, small internship, quick internship at Amazon as a product intern, super fun, very data-driven company. And, right after I finished the MBA program, I actually was part of the founding team. We started a company called ThriveHive. This is in 2011. And so now it's really not really a small business, but more a high-tech, high-growth startup focused on helping small businesses. So that same struggle that I have had, as a small business owner, figuring out your website, your leads, how do you actually make all of these pieces come together? And so we help them through marketing automation. And, we scaled that company, raised venture capital. We went through a local accelerator called Techstars. And, ultimately in 2016, 5 years after we started, we sold the company to New Media. So New Media is the largest publisher of daily and local newspapers in the United States. And we became kind of their technology core for their SMB products. And I stayed with the company for a number of years as CTO for that sort of unified division. And, we were doing around $100 million for my division as I left a few years ago. And so after that, I took some time off, and right now I'm starting a new company called Telescoped, which is really focused on software engineering and specifically remote software engineering, which I think is what kind of brings us together in this conversation.
Yeah, that's good. That's a very interesting background. I love how kind of like you're becoming. I don't know if you consider yourself a serial entrepreneur now, but Maybe after telescope, there comes another one.
Yeah, I think I have the disease, so now I won't stop. I always want to be an entrepreneur. That's what I'm passionate about: building things and solving problems and helping people. So that's definitely the case.
That's amazing. Very, very admirable. So as you mentioned, telescope. So that's really what brings us here. That's why I think this conversation will be very, very interesting. And the thing that I kind of like find the most interesting was that you and your co-founders started this even, before all this became a thing, right? So before we went into lockdown, before this was a pandemic, because you started Telescope at the beginning of 2020, as far as I understand. So tell us a little bit more about, first of all, what is Telescoped, and then how and why you started this, and how did you kind of like get ahead of this whole remote work thing even before it became a worldwide thing right now with the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, the idea has been brewing for quite some time. So, we kind of publicly came out with our website, our brand, and sort of like a public launch this year. But there's been a lot of thought behind it. And the mission with Telescoped, for us is to bring autonomy, opportunity, and purpose to the talented people of the world. So that's the why, that's why we're starting this company. That's what we want to, the impact we want to have in the world. And really, it all started with our last company, with Thrive5, and maybe some of my background, coming from Costa Rica. First at Thrive5, I got a glimpse of remote work and how it could impact our business, right? We had good experiences, we had so-so experiences, and we had amazing experiences with remote work. And this is everything from, a failed outsourcing project with an Indian outsourcing company, all the way to working with an amazing team in Eastern Europe, and ultimately even, finding people directly in Costa Rica and Latin America that were engineers within our teams, and figuring that whole thing out, right? It wasn't easy. You had to put a lot of sort of pieces in place. But, as I left the company, we had 5 locations in the United States. So it's a pretty large operation, and we had to figure out a lot of those things along the way. But actually, when I left that company, and I'm talking about we, because it's really me and my 2 co-founders who are also, former Thrive5 folks. So, when we left, we were really thinking about a different idea. And so that's always like a fun story to tell, that, we were thinking about something else. But one thing we had for sure is we're going to have a distributed team. We're going to have engineers all over the world, and we're going to start in Latin America and Costa Rica, where, we've got a pretty deep network. And so as part of our time off, we traveled, we went down there, met a bunch of amazing engineers, and, more than we could ever bring on board as a super early stage startup. And the thing that really crystallized, this idea of Telescoped in my mind is, talking to our peers and CEOs around the Boston area. There's always people that were struggling to find talent, in a place with more universities than anything else. We've got so many amazing, talented people, and the market was very tight for software engineers. And so these folks were really, struggling to hire people, and I couldn't get it. Like, outsourcing has been around forever. Why don't you consider remote? And it turns out that it's not easy for a company to make that leap. And so we identified that was a problem, and it actually aligned very well, with what we wanted to do in terms of our own passion for, bridging that gap between the talent and the people here in the companies here. But anyways, let me kind of backtrack a little bit in terms of like our own thinking and why we decided to jump in. If you look at what's happened since the Industrial Revolution, not much has changed. Back then, machines were at the heart of a successful business, right? You had a factory with a big manufacturing plant, and people would commute or move close to that plant. And then you had managers who were keeping track of time, and there's like a bell that goes off. I mean, it's pretty sad, but the idea, it's just like, that's the 9 to 5. That's, you have to see, butts on chairs and make sure that the job's getting done. That's the management that you were trying to do, just optimizing the efficiency of that machine. You got your shifts. I mean, it's crazy, right? But things have changed, right? And before COVID, and even more so now in our current setup. And, I actually think another thing that, pushed us towards this idea is listening to Naval Ravikant, who's the CEO of, or founder, I guess not CEO, founder of AngelList. And he was talking about, we're automating more and more. There's artificial intelligence that is taking care of all the things that can be automated. And what's left is really the creative work, right? The most valuable work that humans can add value in. And, imagine you have like all these little self-organizing units solving very, very difficult problems with creative forces, where like, if you're passionate about X, you can join people all over the world, go solve that problem, and then disband. And so a way, I feel like we're entering this era of humanizing the worker, where successful companies have already figured part of this out. Like the idea of culture. Culture plays a big role in the success of a company. I think, you obviously work at HubSpot, and they were early into this like culture, game where like they realized how critical it was to be taken seriously, because it can really change the outcome of a company. But in a way, humanizing the worker has become more front and center, right? Especially now, as we look at kind of what's going on with remote work. And one other thing that, if you kind of want to tie it together to sort of like this big changes that are happening, there's this big power shift as you start realizing that people can work anywhere and in this kind of creative positions. The shift that is happening is that big companies are starting to lose power to the individual, right? Imagine a future where you can, let's say you're passionate about something, you can go find a job, get paid for it, and then go find the next project. And you're like basically doing what you want, what drives you, right?
Yeah.
So the type of work that is going to happen is very different from what's going on today, where the companies dictate everything. And now the individual has more power to choose where they want to work. And so, maybe some things that are great causes, a nonprofit might find easier access to talent in this new future than companies that are, a little bit less exciting to the general population. Maybe I don't want to, talk about like
you don't want to call names.
Yeah, exactly. But there are some industries that are, maybe
more traditional.
Not just traditional, but like that are less aligned with like people's passions and impact and doing good for the world. But anyways, you also see big companies like the Facebooks and Googles and Apples and Amazons of the world investing billions of dollars in their new headquarters, right? And we're talking about this remote world. So what's this disconnect? Well, these companies, they're the incumbents, right? They want to set their power and they want to hoard the talent. They do it through amazing perks and awesome headquarters. They do it through acquisitions where they acquire a lot of people. And so all in all, what they're trying to do is trying to retain that, but that's going to break at some point because, people are going to be much more free to do what they enjoy. But anyways, I've gone on a rant here. So, let me just tell you quickly about Telescope, and then we're going to move on.
Let's get to what Telescope really does, and then we'll keep going with the remote work discussion.
So, first of all, we're really like thinking of Telescope not as an outsourcing company, not as an agency. We're actually finding the best engineers in the world and making them first-class citizens, working shoulder and shoulder with their peers in the US or around the world. And we select the engineers, but we also select the companies, which is critical. So today, Telescope is a community where we're matching those engineers with the best companies, tech companies in the US. And then something that kind of differentiates us and the way we put it in the sort of a certification process is you ask somebody that who's maybe worked at an outsourcing company, is there a chance that you would have become the CTO of that company, of the company was your client? And the typical answer for that is it's just laughter. Like, yeah, of course not. There's no way. And the rationale there is crazy, right? Like you have amazing talent all over the world, but they feel like the ceiling is so low for them. And this is not just for engineering, by the way. Whenever you have remote work, it's kind of the crap, the stuff that nobody wants to do that gets shipped out. And that's the outsourcing, 1.0.
Lowering costs.
That's not remote work, right? Now we're talking about really opening up the talent pool and the opportunities for everyone. So the long-term view for Telescope is to become a vertical marketplace where once you're fully integrated with all the software engineering stack, Amazon Web Services, the cloud providers, the Jira's where you do project management, GitHub where all of the code is hosted, and Slack where communication's happening, and you add on top of that liquidity in terms of companies and engineers, then all of a sudden you are opening up a really interesting opportunity to bridge that gap and make that connection much stronger. And so that's what we're building in the long term.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And I really think that, as you said, we're entering kind of like this remote work 2.0, which, I think to us is the real remote work where you actually have full-time employees that, just as you would have in Boston, if you're a Boston-based company, that are actually, spread all over the US or even all over the world. So, how do you enable those employees and everyone? And, we've been hearing about companies that just go or have gone in the past few years, like fully remote. So we're going to talk a little bit more about, what goes into like enabling a remote work culture and also like system, because it's kind of like a combination of both things. But that's great. That's great. And I know that, you'll be starting in Costa Rica. I know that we have a question that we're probably going to like leave it towards the end from Adrian that asks specifically, what are your thoughts around kind of like Costa Rica and the talent in there? But let's talk a little bit more about kind of like the current situation and how that's going to like position, let's say, the tech industry and in general, like many industries moving forward in terms of remote work. What happened, and what everyone, or like mostly everyone in the world experienced, what, like about a couple of months ago, was that all of a sudden, in a matter of like a week or so, everyone had to like start working remote, except for, of course, like very essential, let's say, businesses and roles. But a lot of the jobs that like could be done from home, or like from whatever you were, started to be done remote. Do you think most companies, Max, in tech and in other industries were prepared for this kind of like very rapid change? And if yes or no, why?
Yeah, well, I think definitely not, right? I mean, I see it anecdotally with just the people that I talk to, you also see it in the data, right? When you look at earnings reports from some of the tech companies, and they're basically the ones powering this remote revolution, they're outperforming the old school companies that are struggling. And it's not fair to say that it's just because they weren't ready; they were impacted more. But the fact that these companies in this environment are thriving, means that there's definitely a little bit of a surge in terms of demand, right? You've got everything from the cloud providers, you've got the SaaS players that are, doing all the infrastructure like CRM, Salesforce, HubSpot, Zendesk, all of these guys. You've got security companies like Okta, all the data tracking folks. All these guys are like surging, right? And obviously Zoom, we're on Zoom right now, and we've seen what happened with that, right? So I think that, these companies are doing great while everybody's trying to scramble basically to figure this out. So I don't think companies were ready at all. I would say maybe there's an exception where the best run companies were ready. And the reason why, in my mind, is that, remote requires a certain amount of discipline and process, right? It doesn't just happen. You have to be deliberate about it.
Just like take your computer home and maybe a monitor,
right.
and your headphones, and you're good. Make sure you have good Wi-Fi, by the way. Yeah,
exactly, right? So I think there's so much more to it, and there's like different levels, right? But if you think about just this huge shift, I think, we were looking at this MIT study. It said from 15% to 50% of the workforce moved to work from home. So now nearly half of the workforce is working from home. It's crazy, right? It's a huge amount of people that didn't have the systems, didn't have the setup. They were just like trying to figure it out as they were going. And, probably many in our audience are in that camp. And I think that, one of the things that happens is when you're co-located, it gives you a little bit of a laxed setup where you can do things suboptimally and it still works, right? Because you've got this management by walking around. You can walk to somebody in an ad hoc way, solve a problem, have a conversation, and that's that. But in reality, when you're working remote, that doesn't work anymore. You have to document things. You have to have a clear communication protocol. There's all these things that need to be put in place. And the other thing that I think is going to be critical in terms of, why people are scrambling is we're not only dealing with the move to remote, we're also dealing with, this huge thing that's happening around us with the pandemic, and just dealing with that is affecting our health, our psyche, the economy, and in a very deep way. You cannot, just don't look at that as part of the equation.
Yeah, definitely. So, and I think, going back to kind of like the couple of articles and studies that we were researching, as we were preparing for this, one thing that I think is interesting, and maybe you can like give us a little bit more insight into that, is all the fixed kind of like investments that a lot of companies had to like incur in a matter of, like a week or 2 weeks in order to enable their workforce to work remote. And then we're going to tie that to like how that's going to become maybe a major reason why this is not going to go away when it's safe, for everyone to like go back to their office. So let's talk a little bit more about what are those investments? Why do you have to make an investment to enable your workforce to work remote? What are kind of like some of the things that are involved there?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's investments in the form of, things that you need to buy, whether that's hardware, software, desks, chairs. I mean, there's like all this kind of getting set up, right? And back to like working remote is not just, oh yeah, we've got email and we've got mobile phones, so you can work remote because you've got a laptop. And even the laptop itself, right? Many companies don't have laptops for all their employees. So, you know, that's an investment. And once you've started to look at some of these things, you know, it does start with physical space, with laptops, microphones, cameras, making sure people have got the right, you know, monitor screens and the basics, even the internet, right? Internet access and routers, and things that you just take for granted. But then you've got all the software that kind of powers all of this new revolution, right? And that's, you know, access control, security, compliance, and all the collaboration software that enables all of this, whether that's, you know, Slack, Zoom, Teams, whatever it is that you're using. And, you know, as you start investing in all of this kind of pieces of the puzzle, you're also investing in what I would say is a cultural change, right? You have to start kind of agreeing how we're going to behave, where we're going to document things, how are the meetings going to be run, where are we going to, you know, capture all of the different design options that we're working on. If you're like a, you know, a software company, how do you actually work in this new normal? But once you've made those investments, there's a few things that will happen. First, they are, you know, they're now done. You have them. They're like at your fingertips. But also your people start realizing that they can do their work in a very effective way. And we can talk more in detail about some of those things. But so I think it's definitely going to change the way people perceive remote work and the effectiveness of working from home, which I think is the most interesting.
Definitely. Yeah. No, and I, you know, I think to a point, the world had to experience kind of like a forced move to this. So that a lot of like companies that were a little bit like more resistant to kind of like that change and that kind of like new wave that was slowly coming really could realize that it's something that is like not only possible, but also beneficial, you know, to a good extent. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that in a second. But right now, I know that as part of kind of like one of those pieces of content that a lot of like startups start publishing, Telescope published a framework for remote work. And that framework is, I think, you know, from what I've seen, is a combination of both what companies and employees need to do to like excel at remote work and to like have a good remote work culture. I'm interested in, I'm gonna share that in the chat right now, but I'm interested in you telling us a little bit more about what like the components from the company side, right? Because like we all know about what employees have to do. There's been a lot of like content around that in the past couple of months, but I don't think there's been as much content about what companies need to do in order to actually enable good remote work, and not really only focus on kind of like the investment, as you said, in like Slack, Zoom, you know, all the communication tools, but also on like the processes, you know, like as you were saying, if, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you don't have anyone to like see that you're doing the work, you know, how are the kind of like more, let's say, documented and formalized process going to come into place to like enable that remote work?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, we opened up the sort of Telescope remote work framework, and this is really like our secret sauce, right? We spent endless hours of research and our own personal experience kind of putting this, and this is what we use internally, so that we just open it to the world as a kind of starting point. And, you know, you guys can just, we can put it in the notes or just.
Yeah, I just added it to the chat right now. So yeah,
okay. Yeah. So, you know, the interesting thing, and some of this might sound a little touchy-feely, but, you know, if you want to get into the deep of it, you know, like the things that actually matter. First of all, I think anybody who has, you know, been thrown into this remote world, I think if you haven't had a chat with your managers, that's where you start, right? And this is not part of the framework. It's just you got to prepare your managers for this new setup, right? Like they've never done it, and so how do you prepare them? Well, you need to have kind of a framework, and that's where it all starts in our minds. And, you know, when you think about the framework, it's really all centered around people. You know, everything that we're going to talk about is really about people. So the first aspect is kind of the daily ritual. So how are people expected to work when they're working from home? You need to be very deliberate about how do you, you know, kind of say like, hey, I'm ready, I'm working, I sat down at my desk, I'm available. So we've got these little rituals, like, you know, like a daily, hey, check in, I'm in, check out when you're like not going to be available, because otherwise it's just a blur, and what you're going to do is burn out your people, right? Yeah. So it all starts with these little things that happen normally through social cues in person. If you've got an office, somebody walks in and they walk out, right? There's social cues. You don't need to like codify that. It's just happening. But when you're remote, you need to codify those things. And that's everything from, you know, the daily ritual of checking in, checking out, but also small things like praise, you know, like, hey, thank you for helping me find this document. Thank you for helping me with that other thing. And so create those spaces for those social cues to happen. in a systematic way. Because if you don't create them, they won't happen. And if they don't happen, bad outcomes will ensue. The second piece of it, I think, is just kind of how you think about documenting all of the things that are necessary. And a good exercise is to think, if somebody were to join my company today, how would I onboard them, right? Well, here's my wiki. In our case, we've got, a wiki where like all of the content is like very well structured. It's all there, and you kind of can see, where everything is, and every part of the product is spelled out, and you can basically like self-onboard if you want it. Right. We of course don't just say like, hey, here's a link, go have at it. There's a process.
Come back to us in a month.
Yeah. But you really need to have that in some place. And most companies never took the time to document stuff. Right. So I think for companies, documenting things, and it's not just the documentation, but also the protocol that you follow to use that documentation. Right. Yeah. So when should I refer to the wiki? When should I use an email? When should I, send somebody a Slack message? You shouldn't be slacking people left and right, because then you're going to be interrupting them all day. So what's urgent, what's not, what's like our communication protocol, which is critical, right? And then some other things that I think, this is more like best practices, but when you're talking about a meeting, especially over Zoom, like, do you really need a meeting? Could you just have a shared document and collaborate on it, comment, things back and forth, and maybe instead of an hour meeting, you do a 5-minute meeting? Everybody's talking about Zoom exhaustion, right? Well, no wonder. If you're just sitting on a meeting and there's 12 people there and you're just like looking at, it's very difficult. Back-to-back meetings on Zoom are exhausting. You shouldn't have more meetings now than you did before. And if anything, you should have less meetings, because you should be spending the time documenting things, because that's going to make the collaboration that much easier. Once you get kind of like up that learning curve, something interesting happens, right? Which is the ability to do work asynchronously. And that's when the magic really starts happening, right? Because one of the things that you see in the framework is, there's like some components around trust, and I won't go into any of those details, but basically the main idea is that you don't need to police people, the butts and chairs thing with the manufacturing thing. We're not working in a manufacturing plant anymore. Tell the people, your team, what needs to get done, document it clearly, collaborate on, these shared documents. And then, if you need to have a meeting, you have it, it's fine. I mean, meetings are useful when there's like a clear agenda and there's like a clear takeaway, and, minutes are taken so that whoever wasn't on that meeting can take advantage of that. But ultimately, don't try to police a 9-to-5 work culture, because that's kind of gone by now, right? You really have to think of this new remote world as a place where like you need to have clear goals, measure outcomes, and then instead of policing your people, enabling them and empowering them to do the best work, because they will be more efficient. They will be, they are going to be working. And if you have fear that they're not working, then you have a different problem in your company. So that's kind of how we approach the framework. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
No, you did. And I think that, again, a matter of not letting it, I think, let play by itself. You need to like make sure that you have like processes in place so that remote work actually is efficient. I think that's kind of like the takeaway. One thing that I wanted to mention from the articles that we were investigating, you can't really like ignore the fact that when you're in an office or in a physical space with people or a team together, a lot of like things and conversations and questions and learning happens ad hoc, right? Like you kind of like just hop on to someone else's desk and you ask something, and you're like, like if you are in kind of like an open space office as well, you can just kind of like have that, let's say, constant communication that could be, like good or bad depending on how you use it. But this article was mentioning that we also need kind of like processes in place in order to not lose most of that. Right? Because, it's not that you're going to be on Slack every day with your team or your team members. It's definitely going to be a little bit harder to have that ad hoc communication. So how do you putting or establish processes so that, again, that you don't lose the benefits of that, those ad hoc things that happen in offices. So I think that was interesting as well.
One comment on that, or a couple of comments. I mean, the first one is, we do have like this idea of a water cooler channel, and I think a lot of people like set up the channel, but nobody uses it, right? So think of like creative ways and make somebody own it, right? Like, you can run like all sorts of creative things that, just this ad hoc things need to happen, right? And they happen on this social water cooler type channel many times, or set up a happy hour, right? And have somebody, not just like have people show up because that's going to be awkward, right? But just have people, somebody can talk about something specific. And as long as you give somebody the ownership of what happens in that channel, then it's much more likely to become a productive source of like more creative ad hoc communication. And one other piece of it, which is especially hard in our time of COVID and social distancing, we do recommend in-person meetings. You might have a team that's distributed, in 20 countries, but bring them together, once, twice, depending on how big you are and all of that, at least once a quarter or once a year, if that's what you can manage. But having people in one place is critical. And out of the 100% of time that you're together, you should probably spend 10% of your time working, and 90% of your time kind of doing other things that are going to enable the sort of more human connection, back to humanizing work.
Definitely. Yeah, I know at least like a few companies that are fully remote already, and like basically just gather all their staff once or twice a year in their headquarters, or anywhere they don't have an actual physical office. And I think that's an essential component of being, let's say, 100% remote as a company. All right, sounds good. So we've talked a little bit about how we got here, how remote work, let's say the status or the state of remote work up to March of 2020. Now where we're living and will continue to live in the months to come, there is going to be a time, hopefully this year, when social distancing measures are relaxed, right? And like there's going to be a month that depending on where you're living, country, state, it's going to be safe to go back to the office, to a certain extent. I think the question that is like on a lot of like companies' minds and a lot of like employees' minds as well right now is what's going to happen, when that actually happens, when that actually comes. Are we going to like anticipate that people are going to go back to the office? People are going to like continue working from home either if their companies allow it. Will companies encourage people to continue working remote, for the foreseeable future or even longer term? What do you think are going to be kind of like more of the longer term impacts of this forced reality that we're living?
Yeah, well, I think there's two parts to the answer. The first is that, obviously the going back to normal is not going to be just flip a switch, which I think is going to create by necessity a little bit of flexibility on the company side and on the employee side. But I do think that people will demand it. Once you've experienced a little bit of the magic of work from home, you might not want it all the time. We were talking about it, just joking about extroverts and like kind of feeling a little bit isolated from the world. So it might not be something you want to do every day of the week. But what about 2 times a week, 3 times a week? I would say most people would say, well, that would be nice. It's probably a healthy balance, right? There's like this survey that the information news outlet did where, they said that more than 60% thought, that they would be in an office 3 days or fewer a week. That's pretty major, right? 60%. And it's not scientific, it's a small sample size, whatever. But I think, again, anecdotally, I feel like people see the good things and the bad things of working from home. So if there's good things, you probably want to keep some of those. One of the obvious ones is no commute. So, if you save an hour or 2 hours every day just by not sitting in a car or a subway cart, that's huge, right? You can use that time to spend with your family. You can use it for many other productive things. The other thing is we talked about earlier, right? The investing in systems and building that muscle, right? Once you've actually developed that muscle as a company, you want to take advantage of it because it's actually like, it's a way also to, open up the talent pool. If you were like Boston based with my Boston headquarters, well, now I can look outside of just the Boston, greater Boston area. I can look outside of just Massachusetts. I could look outside of the US. And, I think that's definitely going to be the case. But, with all of this, I also think that some people might have had a pretty bad experience with their first work from home environment, whether, I don't have a good space because I live in a studio, or, I've got children around and schools are closed, or, I've got somebody in my family who's sick and I'm very worried for them, or I have to take care of them. My setup has poor ergonomics. All sorts of like small or big problems, like people might not have had the best experience. So I think it's going to take some time for people to digest. But, that's a long answer to say definitely. I think people will be more eager to work from home. And I think companies will be more open to that as an option. And, I do think when you start to consider ditching that 5-year lease, the CFO will be very supportive of that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, that's a really good point. You know, and also I think the related to that is, you know, expansion plans or like physical expansion plans that companies already had in terms of, you know, like leasing new office space. I know that, you know, a lot of companies in the tech industry in Boston grew pretty rapidly, and you start kind of like with a floor in some building and then get another floor, and then, you know, all of a sudden you have the entire building. So that, how's that going to be kind of like impacted, right? How are you
Yeah,
going
I
to
saw
manage
this
that?
tweet today, which is very much in line, and it said, you know, like think of, you know, the new company offices as not 10 floors in one
Yeah.
building in one city, but one floor in 10 cities, right? That's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Or one like apartment in like hundreds of
Yeah,
cities.
yeah, yeah,
So I think that the other, let's say, side of this, or the other part of this is not only enabling, let's say, locally based employees to do remote work certain days a week, but actually starting to hire fully remote teams or employees, you know, and I can speak for kind of like my experience in the company I work for here in Boston, HubSpot, that, you know, prior to all this, we already have around 10% of our global workforce that were full-time, or that are, you know, still are full-time remote workers. You know, they're just like based out somewhere in the US or somewhere in the world, and they work fully remote. Um, do you anticipate that, you know, a lot of companies will start hiring more like fully or 100% remote teams? And, you know, what are going to be kind of like some of the benefits and also maybe like cons of that?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think absolutely right, and we had already seen that with even pre-COVID. You know, with some of the best startups. I mean, you're still cash strapped, even if you're like a very hot startup. As you're getting funded, you know, you're resource constrained, and if you're trying to hire, you know, tech people in a tech hub like Boston or New York or San Francisco,
Yeah.
that's not even an option, right? So they were already doing the fully distributed from a little while back. And, you know, again, adding to that the savings on real estate, I mean, access to talent, there's no question that there's a lot of benefits. And, you know, I think before it was, you know, the startups that were forced to do it. But now that, you know, you've seen that it can actually work, and my own people working remote works, and people in my city, my state, my country, the world, right? Like once you've opened it up, it's pretty straightforward to think that that access to that global talent pool is very, very valuable. Now, there's a lot of companies that are enabling that, which I think is the most exciting part. You know, Telescope is doing, you know, its part on the software engineering side, but there's companies that are focusing on different verticals. There's companies that are focusing on managing payroll remotely across horizontal, you know, different industries. And there's people that are doing perks. There's people that are doing setting up remote offices. So I think that's going to become much more available, which means that companies are going to have a much easier time setting that up, because, you know, once you know that it works, you know that you can kind of flex your culture to fit the remote work environment. Yeah, you definitely want to open up the talent pool. So I think it's going to continue to happen. You know, the pros are going to be that talent, like I said, is distributed everywhere in the world. You've got amazing people, so you're going to have a lot of really interesting people kind of enter the talent pool. The cons are that, you know, we're going to have to figure out a lot of things along the way, right? And that's kind
Yeah.
of where the challenge in my mind lies.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to like discuss a little bit more about that in a second. But first, I just wanted to say, you know, we're probably gonna wrap up in like 5 or 10 minutes with, let's say, the scripted questions. I know we have one question from Adrian from like a few minutes ago, but please, if you have any questions or comments, you know, for either Max or myself, please add them to the chat or to the Q&A tool in Zoom, and we're gonna like move on to questions from the audience in a few minutes. So in terms of like the disadvantages or the cons, I think that, you know, a question that I frequently have, and I know a lot more people will have it as well, is are there any like real major disadvantages of having, let's say, a fully or 100% remote workforce that don't really depend on like how we as a company enable it? Let's say, like, put it all the way, are there any things that are just going to be always something negative, like major negative of working or of having remote work teams that I really can't control as a company?
Yeah. Well, I think that there are some areas, and I think they're going to get worked out in the future. But there's still some gaps in terms of the solutions that are out there. The first one, which you talked about earlier, is just human connection and bonding. Like your team members become your family when you're like spending long days, or you have like this crisis. Everybody has to come to the office to the war room and figure things out. That builds certain rapport that it's hard to build remotely, right? And that's why trying to supplement the remote experience with in-person gatherings is critical. But I think it's not the same when you do it once a year or once a quarter than if you're like constantly seeing people and they become your friends, you get to know their families. Like you need to force some of those, but it's going to be hard. Another one could be security, right? Like ultimately you have devices all over the place that have access to your systems, to your computers, to your servers, to your data. And there are security solutions out there, but it's much easier to control a centralized location when you have a team of IT or your security officers taking care of that than if you've got people all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are like some of the biggest ones that I've seen are still kind of hard to tackle, and maybe just like that ad hoc kind of like communication by osmosis that happens sometimes because you just you're passing by, you heard somebody say something, and then you kind of jumped into a conversation. It's hard to sort of produce that serendipity, I guess.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's at least a couple, but like from what everyone has, I think, been hearing lately, it does seem that the pros outweigh the cons very, very, very much. So yeah, we'll see. I think we'll see what happens. I don't think anyone really like has the answer, even in the tech industry. But like a Q3, Q4, I think it'll be very interesting to see what's really the status of a lot of people, in Boston and also like nationwide and globally, in terms of their like physical work situation. It's gonna be an interesting one. Related to that, and like I don't see any. I'm just gonna ask one more question, and then we'll take Adrian's question, and then we'll see if there's any more questions or comments from the audience here. But of course, we're both based out of Boston, and we're very familiar with the industry here, and also like in general in the U.S. But we're both from Latin America. You're from Costa Rica, I'm from Ecuador, myself. How do you think that remote work, or how do you think that, let's say, different geographical regions will differ in adopting remote work, if there's going to be a difference? So first, do you think there's going to kind of like be a difference, in the way that, where the pace in which kind of like LATAM adopts remote work with the challenges that it has, APAC or Southeast Asia, Europe, the United States? Do you see like differences in there? And
Yeah, I think definitely, right? I think that if you think of the different areas and the reasons for adopting remote work, many of them might have to do it out of necessity. So obviously I'm very familiar with Costa Rica, where I think the economy in Central and Latin America is going to be heavily impacted, probably much more so than the U.S. economy, because we cannot print dollars down there. I think that that's going to force a lot of people to sort of take on remote work. But then some of the basic infrastructure might not be the same across different countries, right? Even back to like the basics, right? And I see it with some of the folks in Costa Rica, where the internet bandwidth is so overwhelmed right now that the country is basically like trying to keep up with demand. So there's like this little like infrastructure things that are in place that make it hard or easy for countries to adopt it. And then you layer on top of that, kind of like the legal, so like legislative realities, right? Some of these countries, setting up a business, setting up a contractor, setting up a remote office is super simple, and they've got like all these systems and government organizations in place, and some others are not, and they're lagging behind, right? And everything from taxation to all of these different things, right? Where like it just completely changes the landscape, and depending on how fast they are to adopt kind of like this new reality, they might benefit or hinder their population in terms of their access to remote work. So that's Latin America. I think that in Eastern Europe, at least in the software engineering world, they've kind of had a little bit of a head start. And I would also say that's the case in some specific countries where companies have started doing like the big multinationals set up their shops. So now there's like a big kind of anchor. And from there, people have experienced some of that work remotely because they work with that big company, but basically back to headquarters. So they're used to it. and getting that adoption in terms of cultural norms is much easier. Places that don't have that because they've been much more kind of protectionist or they've got their own industry, I think will struggle more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a spot on. I think one thing we know for sure is that probably like the U.S. one is going to be one of the countries that is gonna like lead the way in this, let's say, adaptation or kind of like revolution to remote work. And as you say, like a lot of American companies that have offices in Latin America or other regions will kind of like start to influence that locally and create a culture where remote work is definitely more accepted and also enabled.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So yeah, let's tackle Adrian's question. So he's asking why, besides your personal background, you think Costa Rica is a good place to focus your remote work sourcing efforts.
Okay, not to toot my own horn, but I think that Costa Rica, has a lot of things going in terms of the underlying requirements. We're talking about infrastructure and foreign direct investment. So back in the 90s, Intel Corporation set up a huge anchor plant, which I think opened up the country to a lot of foreign direct investment with companies like Amazon and Akamai. I could probably go on and on. HP, some of the largest companies set up shop there. You tie that together with some of the best education systems in the region, where we've got a very highly educated workforce, very much bilingual. And when you tie all of that with political stability, the time zone alignment, and the closeness to the U.S., I think that's kind of like the perfect storm for enabling remote work. We do think that one of as we think of Telescoped on our own mission, we've got some pretty big goals ahead of us, and Costa Rica is the starting point. But we're also a small country, right? I think that the rest of the region, whether it's Central America or more into South America, we're also going to expand into those locations for sure.
So as a follow-up to that, like we have one more question from Kimberly, but as a follow-up to that, because it's connected, which countries do you see as kind of like good, let's say, hubs for this, like at least for like Telescope, for like this remote, like source of remote workers for American companies, specifically for tech talent, and why?
Yeah. So, well, definitely starting with Costa Rica because of the unfair advantage and my connections there. A similar country in terms of, culture and obviously a little bit bigger is Colombia. We already have, well, not us, but there's already a lot of people that are doing that type of work from Colombia. And I think that, again, it's just access to talent, the cost of living, the stability, as of recent, and a lot of things that are going well in terms of the legal aspect of setting up a company and all of that stuff. And then as you start going down south, I think, there are countries that have a long history of outsourcing and remote work to a certain extent, like Argentina, but it's probably much harder to set up, offices in a country like Argentina, not only because of the, political and economic instability, but also because of the legal aspects of doing that. So I think we're going to go probably more towards the rest of the southern cone with Peru and that sort of thing as we expand.
Got it. Awesome. All right. So let's go with Kimberly's question. Like, please add any more questions that we have. This is the last one. If we don't have any more questions, I think we could probably just wrap it up a little bit earlier. We got another one right now. So Kimberly's asking us, she's telling us that she's a new intern to a team that is fully virtual now. Probably something that is happening to a lot of people today, whether they're interns or full-time workers. She is asking, how can she create friendships, connections, and mentor-mentee relationships virtually? Do we have any tips for that?
Yeah, well, it's funny that you bring that up. So one of the things that we do with our companies when we onboard them to Telescope is, if you have one of our engineers as part of your team, we set up a buddy, and this is somebody who's not your manager. They're just a buddy, like a 3-month period where, like, if you have any questions, you want somebody to just hang out, get an understanding of who's who, get an introduction to somebody else that might be in your department, but you might have never spoken to them. And that's kind of like one of the things that we bring to the table as a company, is that we've got this kind of credibility to say like, well, we should have a buddy system, right? As an intern, I think it's probably harder for you, Kimberly, to go into your manager's office and demand to have a buddy. But maybe, you could ask for somebody that can be a peer in a different department that they can connect you with to get to understand the culture better. And so be proactive about it. I think, as companies are figuring things out, not everybody has all the right processes, not everybody has all the right things in place. But you can drive that from the bottom up and say like, hey, I would love to get a better understanding of different people in the company. Can I set up like a coffee chat with one person from one department, a peer, or not a peer, over the next 4 weeks to get to know the people and the company better. So I would suggest that you actually be proactive about it. And obviously you're already working with some people and with your managers. So I would say like reach out to them and ask for very, very pointed, this is my need. I want to get to know the people in the company, and there's no specific agenda. It's just a coffee chat.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think a lot of it depends on kind of like what the company culture is in general, like, can you just like Slack or like contact anyone and ask them for like a coffee chat? But if not, like, as Max was saying, definitely starting with like someone in your department, whether it's your direct manager or someone else, and saying, hey, like I want to meet people. Doing it physically right now is not possible. How, what do you suggest is the best approach to like go about this? And yeah, like I think like very, very being proactive, and like hopefully that will like later like expand in general in the company, so that they can like start enabling more of this and have it be more something coming like top down.
One other thing that could work is, I don't know if there's like, I don't know how big the company is, but if there's like interest groups, let's say you're talking about friendships, that's a little harder, right? But friendships are totally usually kind of aligned around common interests. So let's say that you're super passionate about X. Is there a way for you to like ask your manager to say like, hey, I want to start like a special interest group around X. Can I be the driver of that? So you got to put in the work, but hopefully that will attract people with like-minded people. So.
Yeah, and like since we're talking about like kind of proactiveness and like reaching out to people, I think that outside of work as well, I think I've heard from a lot of people being able to like, let's say, get a hold or like connect with people that you usually wouldn't be able to connect with, that are very like busy, like either traveling or working or in anything during like normal times, but that right now are pretty much just kind of like staying home and kind of like spare like 20 or 30 minutes. I know that I myself have been doing that with certain people in the startup ecosystem down there in Latin America. So that I think that's something that a lot of people are open to right now.
Definitely.
And then Mario, just as a comment, he's saying that he agrees that virtual only mixers are a great way to bring a team together and remind them that they're not alone. So it seems that Mario is also like experimenting with that in his company. Awesome. I don't think we have any more questions, Max. I don't know if you had any other like final thoughts or anything else.
I mean, I just maybe to wrap up, I think that as much as, it's a very hard thing that brought us into this kind of remote world, I think that there's a lot of positive things that come out of remote, everything from, more passionate team members because you're accessing talent where maybe there isn't as many opportunities as in these tech hubs that we live in. You're probably going to see more diversity just because of different cultures, which, breeds more creativity. And, I think that just general happiness for people is going to go up once we're after this big hurdle, which, hopefully is going to translate to happier employees, more efficient, more impact created for the companies that are working with these remote employees. But, I do think that as this creativity spikes and, we're going through hard times, you're going to see a lot of innovation. So, we can't we shouldn't lose track of seeing that innovation as a very positive thing that is happening. And being part of that is something that all of us can do, every day. And, hopefully paired with a lot of empathy, from a society point of view, we'll come out very strong out of this, this sort of like black chapter in our history.
Awesome. Yeah. I love that you mentioned the impact on diversity over there. I think that's something that would, allow for another entire webinar to talk about it. But awesome. So thank you, Max. I hope everyone enjoyed this. We're going to be sharing the recording later via email. But yeah, I appreciate it, Max, and it was great talking to you.
Thank you very much. This was awesome. Thanks for setting it up.
Have a good Tuesday, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.